Hi everybody and welcome to the Serverless Coffee Break. Happy Friday. I've got my cup of coffee here. I hope you've got your cup of coffee to join us for 15 minutes. Today's guest, I've got Ben Ellerby. He's the Vice President of Engineering at Theodo. He's also a new Serverless hero. So we talked about the Serverless Hero program a little bit last week, but Ben's one of the first people in 2020 to join the program. He's the editor of Serverless Transformation, which is a blog, newsletter, and podcast about all things serverless. And he was also a speaker at Serverless Days Nashville earlier this year, where he talks about things like custom runtimes and security. So welcome, Ben, to the show. How are you doing?
Hey, James. Not too bad. Yourself?
Not too bad. It's Friday, so that's pretty good. So you started the Serverless user group in London. I was going to ask you, when did you start this? How long have you been running it? And how has it changed?
Yes, it's not so much I started it. Ant Stanley, another AWS serverless hero, started it initially, and then it sort of petered out mid last year due to some of his other commitments. I'd really got into serverless by that point. We were doing a lot of service at Theodo, and I was really wanting there to be a meetup space again. So I got in touch with the guys at Serverless. They put me in touch with Ant, and then we've relaunched it together, sort of sharing the responsibility of getting the meetup going. And yeah, since we've relaunched it sort of at the end of last year, we've had quite a few events going, and obviously since recent events, we've shifted to a remote format, which has meant we've sort of had an audience across the world rather than just in London, which is nice.
Yeah. So how was it that you at Theodo got first involved in serverless?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been doing, Lambdas around the place for a long time, traditional containerized projects, but there's a PDF that needs to be generated or some microservice for payments. And we were using the serverless framework for that, but it wasn't like at all 100% serverless stacks. We did a lot of containers, a lot of Docker, a lot of Kubernetes. More recently, we've really been focusing on 100% serverless. We saw it as really being at a point of maturity even before, but about a year ago, we put a lot of effort into it, started doing 100% serverless projects, and started doing a lot of training projects. So startups and large companies wanting to build with serverless, helping them build an initial product with it, but focusing on pair programming and training them on best practices. Because serverless is massively and powerful. The abstraction is really cool, but it also exposes developers to quite a wide range of the stack, from front end to back end, security issues, IAM, all the different aspects of cloud development. So we've been using it for 100% serverless projects with our clients. We've been using it on partially serverless projects, but more and more we're recommending it as the go-to architecture for really most of the projects coming in these days.
Yeah. So how do you find it's different between talking to startups and talking to enterprises in terms of your implementation?
So the implementation, they use similar tools, but the approach is different. So with a startup starting 100% serverless, if you leverage things like Cognito for identity provision, API gateway, Lambda, DynamoDB, S3, you can really get quite a fully fledged product out very quickly. And more recently, we're using EventBridge to sort of handle microservice communication, which allows startups to build really state-of-the-art architectures with a small team. With the larger companies, it's a lot about trying to make that change happen across the company. So starting with a small sort of proving the concept internally. Okay, let's find a PDF being generated in a finance department. Let's convert that to serverless, reassure the security guys that you can have really good security practices and even better security practices with serverless. Reassure the developers that they're going to have good tooling around observability and debugging, because that's something that was lacking in the past and maybe gave serverless a bit of a bad name. And reassure the business that the cost on their cloud bill is going to be low, but also the total cost of ownership in terms of developers being able to manage their own infrastructure and the speed and agility is there. So with startups, it's more instantly valuable in sort of the whole stack. With the large companies, it's often starting a migration by taking one application and migrating it, or potentially a new product or a new service, building that out in serverless, and then starting to have common patterns across the company so other teams can start to go, those guys did that, the security team were good with it, we can do this sort of pattern. How can we copy that approach on our project?
Yeah, and you mentioned EventBridge. You had a really interesting article a couple of weeks ago on Medium about EventBridge storming. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so EventBridge is a really great tool from AWS coming out at the end of last year, and is the biggest announcement in serverless since Lambda, and a lot of people in the community really resonate with that. It's a really powerful tool for microservice communication, for integration with third-party like SaaS providers like Zendesk and others can integrate directly into EventBridge. So having this centralized bus of events is super useful. And it's kind of similar to the service-oriented architectures and the enterprise service bus of the past, but without any of the management, completely serverless, really good developer experience and integrating really well with services. Event storming is a workshop exercise that we started using with our clients using EventBridge. It borrows heavily from domain-driven design and an extension of domain-driven design called event storming, which has been around for a while. But it really focuses on taking that event storming workshop where you map out the different entities in your business domain, the aggregates, and most specifically, the domain events. So things like order placed, item returned, help ticket raised. As a group working with the business across silos in a large organization, or with a startup, obviously the communication is quite fast. So having everybody there, really a whiteboard session, loads of post-it notes, loads of space, really collaborative. It goes through a couple of different stages from the events to sort of then categorizing them into sort of aggregates, and then something called bounded contexts, which is a domain-driven design term that has a bit of complexity to it, but in the simplest term, it's just sort of making those logical groupings. And when we're talking about serverless microservices, the target is really reducing the number of connections and dependencies between those different microservices. We've seen a lot of companies struggling with having gone down a serverless approach, but building a distributed monolith or a very large Lambda functions, a lot of code sharing between all the departments, and it's become a bit of a mess. With architectures that are based strongly in domain-driven design, doing something like EventBridge storming to really understand and then build services out of that using EventBridge as a communication mechanism, we're seeing teams move really quickly and having really great tooling around that microservice communication. And that tooling is getting a lot better. Things like the EventBridge schema registry, which is going to come into GA soon, is really powerful to allow developers to see the schema, the structure that is of the events flying over their event buses, be able to have a typed version of that in their ID when they're coding. And that allows teams, let's say the marketing team, to understand what the structure of an order from the order placement team looks like, and be able to use that event to, I don't know, send an email after an order's been placed to do a survey. It allows teams to coordinate and communicate through schema rather than through APIs in terms of like synchronous API requests, which becomes quite tightly coupled. But the schema, they're very much the domain version of the events. They don't change so much. So teams can communicate very efficiently, and there's not so much the tight coupling between the different microservices.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you think event-based architecture is really changing the way that we think about building serverless applications?
I think we really started sort of thinking asynchronously a little while back in the serverless community, like because when it started, it was very much synchronous request response. You had API gateway in front of a Lambda function, you had quite a bad cold start, and then you'd get your response back. All that, like, things have got a lot better in terms of the developer toolings and the performance of Lambda functions and a lot of things. But what's really happened is people are starting to think more asynchronously. Lambda destinations are part of that. EventBridge is a big part of that. DynamoDB streams are a part of that. People are starting to think about just dispatching events, letting the side effects happen, rather than making a synchronous request, having a Lambda calling another Lambda, calling an SQS queue, which then triggers another Lambda. They were very hard to debug. The performance wasn't good. Building more asynchronous architectures allows a lot more power, flexibility, and speed from serverless approaches, but it's a lot of complexity. So I think EventBridge has really helped take a lot of that complexity away and allow teams to focus on the application development whilst thinking asynchronously about events. And that's where EventBridge storming is a useful exercise for the business, actually, to start thinking about their processes in terms of events, because the more complicated the business domain is, exponentially, the more complicated the code becomes. So I think exercises like EventBridge storming to get businesses to think about their processes, break down the silos, and figure out where the boundaries are in the different contexts in their businesses, coupled with the move to asynchronicity, tools like EventBridge, is allowing companies to build really powerful microservice event-driven architectures. And serverless is taking away all the pain points around, managing your own infrastructure and the complexities of microservices to allow those developers to move really quickly, build applications at scale at low cost, and really focus on the business value, which at the end of the day is really what the promise of all these tools is to allow developers to build amazing applications, not allow developers to maintain complex infrastructure.
Yeah, and I was going to mention as well that you're behind one of the brains behind the serverless developer tools, and I've put the URL on the screen for people to see how to access that. It's an amazing set of tools. So how did that come about?
Yeah, so SLS Dev Tools, which was a project that was really a side project one evening in the office, me and another architect were getting frustrated at clicking through many pages of the AWS console when we were debugging an issue in production for a client. So after we fixed the issue, of course, we started to think about, okay, how can we make this better? And it started off as a very basic bash script that would give you some metrics and quite fast feedback, building on top of the serverless framework at that point. We then re-architected it to be more of a dashboard, so it's completely in your terminal. We really wanted the feedback for developers to be as close to them as the work they were doing. So not when you're doing back-end development of the system, having to jump to a web browser all the time. Instead, staying in your IDE and staying in your terminal, but getting the feedback on important metrics. Things like, has the code I've just written increased the duration of my Lambda function, which can have impacts to other parts of the architecture and also your bill at the end of the day. Yeah. Being able to get instant feedback on the last duration of your Lambda function after you've deployed and run the code directly in your terminal, being able to do an SLS deploy, being able then to invoke the Lambda function, and then within a few seconds, seeing a new bar on a bar chart telling you in milliseconds how long that took and comparing that to the last 5 invocations you've made was really useful for our teams to be more connected to targeted metrics. Now it's no longer based on the serverless framework. It's based completely on CloudWatch. So it uses the AWS SDK to pull from CloudWatch. It uses the AWS authentication that you're already familiar with, and you can do stuff like pass particular policies, allowing you to do MFA and that sort of thing. But in running one command, you instantly see a dashboard where you can see all the Lambda functions in your stack. You can select a Lambda function, see a graph of the invocation history, hot reloading logs from CloudWatch, those invocation durations in a bar chart, the region you're deployed in. And more recently, we've released Event Bridge support. Because a lot of our teams were doing a lot of Event Bridge-based developments, they started to hit a bit of a pain point around when we had API gateway fronted Lambda functions, and we could just make an HTTP request in Postman or curl. Like the debugging feedback, the calling the Lambda function was quite traditional and quite known, and there were a lot of tools around it for the developers. When we moved to Event Bridge-based architectures, we didn't necessarily have that HTTP request all the time. We had these more complex flows. I say complex, not complex in how we build them, but using less traditional tools. So maybe an event on Event Bridge triggers a couple of Lambda functions to do some sort of action. Now, if we're working on one of those Lambda functions, we need to trigger an event into Event Bridge. And some teams are writing small scripts to trigger an event using the SDK. And it's quite easy to write, but you don't really want to have to run your own scripts and have that in your code base. So we added that into Serverless Dev Tools. So in the bottom right, you see a list of all the event buses in Event Bridge. You can press I on one of those event buses and opens a small modal all inside the CLI where you can type the source and a JSON body and then submit that event. And then you'll see that Lambda function that you're watching. You'll see that invocation in the logs and the new duration and a couple of other statistics. That's even been extended even more. And today we're releasing support for the Event Bridge schema registry, only in regions where it's supported. But now by pressing R when you're on one of those event buses, you'll see all the different schemas that are available on your event bridges. You'll be able to go into those, click on a particular event, and actually generates a multi-page form inside of the modal, still all inside the CLI, that allows you to fill in the different attributes of that payload. It then converts that into the JSON, populates that as the body. You can then edit the source or other attribute you want and submit. And that's going to be extended to be able to re-trigger events very quickly, which is very useful when you're developing to just keep triggering the same events. And maybe in the future be able to re-trigger failed events, potentially in a staging or production-like environment, rather than just being focused on the developer environment. But largely this tool is to empower developers to work quicker. It's not a replacement for something like Thundra, Epsagon, or Lumigo, which are dedicated serverless observability providers. It's really providing the developer in the moment when they're developing on their dev stack, or if maybe they're fixing something on staging or production, giving them feedback on what they're doing, and also reducing the number of clicks through the console. So when you're on one of the Lambda functions, pressing O will open the relevant page of the AWS console so you can see the configuration and other statistics rather than clicking through the console. Same with the event buses, and more and more of that sort of functionality is coming out soon.
Great. And so if I'm a new serverless developer and I want to try this, how do I first start using the serverless developer tools?
Sure. So you just go to npm, and all this is in the docs. You do an npm install sls-dev-tools. This will then install globally, or you can do it in your repository if you want. You can then run that command SLS dev tools from the command line. At the moment, you pass all via arguments in the command line. So the stack name, the CloudFormation stack name, the region, and optionally the AWS profile. Otherwise, it will look in your environment variables, or if you have a default profile in your AWS credentials file. That will then display the whole dashboard. If you press H, you get a small help modal, which tells you all the different shortcuts and functionalities. Yep. And then importantly, the next bit is to use the tool, then go to GitHub and give us feedback via GitHub issues, because that's really how the tool's getting powerful. We had Serkan, the CTO of Fundra, making a pull request at the weekend.
Great.
We've had calls with Lego and other people. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the familiar faces in the serverless world giving feedback and ideas about where we can go with this. We actually have a team, this started as a small side project for me, but we actually have a team at Theodo maintaining this, making sure we're closing those issues, making sure we're closing the pull requests, and making sure we're adding new functionality. So now's the time really to try and give feedback if you can, because we really think we can make this sort of a de facto tool to try and simplifying serverless development for people just joining to understand what metrics they should look at and simplify some aspects, but also for expert users to dig into those more complex metrics as they go.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ben, for taking a few minutes today to talk to us. And I recommend everybody look at what Ben has on Medium and YouTube. He's got some amazing stuff out there that's really at the forefront of some of the thinking that's going on in serverless. So thanks, Ben. Next week, we have Marcia Villalbo, who's coming on. She's one of my AWS colleagues who's been doing videos and things on serverless really as long as anybody else. I'm really excited that she'll be joining us. My name's James Bezic. I'm a serverless DA, so if you have any questions at all about Lambda or anything in serverless, definitely talk to me or one of my DA colleagues like Chris, Rob, Ben, Eric, and Julian. Any of us can help you. We're really happy to hear from you all the time. So I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks ever so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.